What really happened inside the mansion of the man who built Kentucky Fried Chicken? This is not a story about fast food logos or catchy slogans. It is a story about a house that witnessed ambition, conflict, loyalty, betrayal, exhaustion, love, and legacy. A house that functioned not just as a residence, but as a command center for one of the most unlikely business empires in American history. A house where deals were made, recipes were protected, standards were enforced, and reputations were defended with ferocity. A house where success finally slowed down long enough to become a life. When people think of the founder of KFC, they picture a smiling old man in a white suit, frozen in time on a cardboard bucket. What they rarely consider is where that man lived, how he worked behind closed doors, and what unfolded once the cameras stopped rolling. The mansion in Shelbyville, Kentucky, known as Blackwood Hall, was not a symbol of excess or indulgence. It was a working property, a headquarters, a training ground, a refuge, and at times, a battlefield. Inside its walls, future franchise owners were tested and trained. Inside its kitchen, the standards of an empire were enforced by hand, not memo. Inside its rooms, the founder wrestled with the consequences of selling his life's work, clashing with the corporate future of the brand he created. And inside that house, alongside him, was a woman whose role in the story has often been minimized, despite being essential to everything that survived. This mansion saw the transformation of a struggling roadside cook into a global icon. It also witnessed the anger of a man watching his creation change in ways he could not control. It held the quiet routines of old age, the discipline of daily rituals, the weight of legacy, and eventually, the stillness that comes when a life finally ends. What happened inside the KFC founder's mansion is not folklore. It is not marketing. It is documented, lived history, and it reveals a truth far more complex than the brand ever allowed the public to see. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the real histories behind iconic fortunes, legendary figures, and the private spaces where power was actually exercised. If you want stories that go deeper than headlines and logos, subscribe now and stay with us. Blackwood Hall did not announce itself as the headquarters of a global empire. There were no gates, no guards, no grand drive meant to intimidate visitors. The White Mansion sat calmly along the Kentucky roadway, its posture more dignified than dramatic, more restrained than ostentatious. From the outside, it looked like what it was originally built to be in the aftermath of the Civil War. A prosperous Southern home meant for stability, not spectacle. And yet, beginning in the late 1950s, this quiet structure became one of the most consequential private spaces in American business history. When Harlan Sanders purchased Blackwood Hall in 1959, he was already famous, but not yet secure. Kentucky Fried Chicken was growing rapidly, but it was still fragile. The franchise system depended almost entirely on Sanders himself, his presence, his reputation, his personal authority. There were no massive corporate offices, no layers of executives, no standardized training centers. Everything flowed through him, and now everything would flow through this house. The mansion quickly became more than a residence. It became a nerve center. Phones rang constantly. Letters arrived daily. Franchise applicants came from across the country, sometimes unannounced, hoping to meet the colonel, hoping to taste the chicken prepared by the man himself, hoping to secure permission to use his name. Blackwood Hall absorbed it all. The formal rooms became informal offices, the dining areas doubled as meeting spaces, and the kitchen, small by commercial standards, became the most important room in the building. This was where the myth dissolved into discipline. Sanders did not believe recipes could be taught by pamphlet. He believed they had to be demonstrated, corrected, repeated, and enforced. Inside that kitchen, under the watchful eye of the colonel in his white suit, future franchise owners learned that the brand was not negotiable. Measurements mattered, timing mattered, pressure mattered. If someone rushed a step or cut a corner, Sanders noticed. And if he noticed, he reacted. The mansion echoed with raised voices more often than polite conversation. Sanders was not a gentle teacher. He believed standards were meaningless if they were not defended aggressively. Franchise trainees were corrected publicly, sometimes harshly. Mistakes were pointed out immediately. Excuses were dismissed. Those who survived the process left with a clear understanding. Kentucky Fried Chicken was not a suggestion. It was a command. Claudia Sanders operated quietly, but decisively alongside him. While Harland enforced standards face-to-face, Claudia managed logistics. She answered phones, tracked orders, handled correspondence, and, most critically, oversaw the preparation and distribution of the seasoning blend. The myth of the 11 herbs and spices often obscures the reality that someone had to physically mix, package, and ship that blend. That work happened behind Blackwood Hall, in a separate structure that functioned as a warehouse and supply center. Claudia controlled access. No one handled the blend without her involvement. Inside the mansion, the couple developed a rhythm. Mornings were structured. Sanders rose early, dressed carefully, and prepared for another day of travel or training. Breakfast was brief but deliberate. Business began immediately afterward. Visitors were received throughout the day. Journalists came seeking interviews. Executives came seeking reassurance. Franchise owners came seeking approval. The house rarely rested. And yet, for all the activity, Blackwood Hall was never transformed into a corporate shell. Personal items remained visible. Family photographs lined the walls. Religious texts sat on bedside tables. Awards and certificates were displayed without ceremony, integrated into daily life rather than isolated as trophies. Sanders did not separate his identity as a businessman from his identity as a man. The mansion reflected that fusion. This closeness between life and work became especially important after 1964, when Sanders sold Kentucky Fried Chicken to a group of investors. On paper, the sale freed him. In practice, it complicated everything. He retained the role of public spokesman, traveling extensively and representing the brand, but decision-making power no longer belonged to him. The brand he had built from nothing was now subject to cost-cutting, efficiency mandates, and corporate logic that conflicted directly with his instincts. Those conflicts followed him home. Inside Blackwood Hall, Sanders complained openly about what he saw happening to his chicken. Visitors heard it, Claudia heard it, franchisees heard it. He believed quality was being sacrificed for scale. He believed shortcuts were being normalized. He believed the soul of the operation was being diluted. And because Blackwood Hall was still his headquarters in spirit, if not in ownership, it became the place where that frustration accumulated. The mansion absorbed the tension of a man watching his life's work evolve beyond his control. Phone calls ended abruptly. Letters were dictated angrily. Visits to KFC locations often ended with public criticism. Those moments were not spontaneous. They were the result of private conversations and reflections that began inside the walls of the house. Blackwood Hall also became the site of defiance. When Sanders and Claudia converted the warehouse behind the house into a restaurant, they were not simply opening another business, they were making a statement. The food served there reflected Sanders's original standards, prepared without compromise. The restaurant operated as proof that his methods still worked, that customers still responded to quality when it was protected. The proximity of that restaurant to the mansion was intentional. This was not a separate venture. It was an extension of the same philosophy that had governed everything inside the house. Meals served there were discussed afterward at the mansion. Feedback mattered. Regulars were remembered. The operation was monitored closely. Sanders may have sold KFC, but inside Blackwood Hall, he never surrendered his authority over what he believed food should be. The house also witnessed moments of vulnerability rarely associated with the Colonel's public image. Travel exhausted him. Public appearances demanded energy he increasingly struggled to summon. Inside the mansion, away from cameras, he allowed himself to rest, to complain, to reflect. Claudia provided stability during these moments. She regulated his schedule when possible. She absorbed his anger when necessary. She remained the constant presence anchoring him to something smaller than the global brand that now bore his face. As Sanders aged, Blackwood Hall shifted again. The pace slowed slightly, though never fully. Training sessions became less frequent. Travel was more selective. The house grew quieter in the evenings. The rituals remained, but they softened. Dinner became less about business and more about routine. The mansion began to function less as a battlefield and more as a refuge. Still, it never stopped being a place of work. Even near the end of his life, Sanders reviewed correspondence there. He discussed brand issues there. He entertained visitors who wanted to see where it had all happened. The mansion carried the weight of expectation from outsiders who viewed it as a shrine, and from Sanders himself, who saw it as proof that his journey had been real. When illness finally confined him to hospitals, Blackwood Hall waited. Claudia returned alone. The rooms that had once been filled with noise and instruction held silence instead, but the structure did not feel abandoned. It felt like a place that had completed its primary purpose. What happened inside the KFC founder's mansion during those years was not glamorous. It was not cinematic. It was disciplined, tense, repetitive, and deeply human. It was the daily work of protecting standards in a world increasingly designed to erode them. It was the struggle of an individual against scale. It was the merging of domestic life and corporate consequence inside a space never meant for either. Blackwood Hall did not create the Colonel's legacy on its own, but it contained it, it shaped it, and it preserved the final version of a man who refused to become a symbol only, insisting instead on remaining a participant until the very end. As the years progressed, the role of Blackwood Hall continued to evolve in ways that even Harlan Sanders had not anticipated. What had begun as a headquarters for growth slowly transformed into a place of reckoning. The mansion was no longer fueling expansion. It was absorbing consequence. Every decision Sanders had made across his life seemed to echo inside its walls, forcing him to confront what success had cost and what it no longer guaranteed. After the sale of Kentucky Fried Chicken, Sanders discovered that authority without ownership was an unstable position. Publicly, he remained the face of the brand. Privately, he felt increasingly sidelined. Inside Blackwood Hall, this contradiction was impossible to escape. The phone still rang, letters still arrived, but many of the calls were no longer requests for guidance. They were notifications, announcements, explanations after decisions had already been made elsewhere. Sanders listened, then responded with frustration that had nowhere productive to go. He was no longer shaping outcomes. He was reacting to them. And for a man whose entire identity had been built on direct control, that loss cut deeply. Visitors noticed the change. Those who came to Blackwood Hall in the early 1960 seconds encountered a man energized by momentum. Those who came later encountered someone sharper, more guarded, quicker to anger. Conversations shifted tone rapidly. Praise for expansion could turn into criticism of execution in the same breath. Sanders had not softened with age. If anything, his standards hardened as the world moved further away from them. The mansion became the one place where he could still speak freely. Journalists learned that interviews conducted at Blackwood Hall were different from those staged elsewhere. Sanders spoke more openly there. He complained more, he criticized more directly. He felt protected by the familiarity of his surroundings. This was his ground, and on his ground, he did not censor himself. That candor created problems. Statements made at the mansion traveled outward, sometimes landing in newspapers, sometimes reaching corporate executives who wished they had not been said at all. Lawsuits followed. Threats followed. Settlement negotiations followed. Each time, Blackwood Hall absorbed another layer of tension. And yet, Sanders never considered leaving. To outsiders, the mansion might have seemed like a quiet retirement property. In reality, it functioned as a psychological anchor. Sanders had spent most of his life drifting between jobs, towns, identities. Blackwood Hall represented permanence. Leaving it would have meant admitting that even stability was temporary. He refused that conclusion. Inside the house, routines became sacred. Meals occurred at consistent times. Clothing was selected carefully. Sanders continued to wear his white suit daily, even when no cameras were present. It was not performance. It was discipline. The suit reminded him who he was supposed to be, even when the world around him felt increasingly unrecognizable. Claudia understood this instinctively. She protected his routines when possible. She filtered interruptions. She absorbed logistical burdens so he could focus on the parts of life that still gave him purpose. In many ways, Blackwood Hall became a shared project of preservation, not of wealth, but of identity. The restaurant behind the mansion intensified this role. Running the Claudia Sanders Dinner House allowed Sanders to assert control in a way the corporate brand no longer permitted. The menu reflected his values. The preparation reflected his standards. There were no focus groups, no quarterly earnings calls, no marketing departments. There was only food, guests, and execution. Inside Blackwood Hall, meals from the restaurant were discussed in detail. Texture, temperature, timing. Sanders remained exacting. Staff were corrected indirectly through Claudia when necessary. Compliments were rare. Consistency was expected. The restaurant functioned as proof that his philosophy had not become obsolete, regardless of what corporate executives believed. This dual existence, global icon and local restaurateur, created a strange imbalance. Sanders traveled constantly, appearing in commercials, attending openings, shaking hands with people who knew him only as a symbol. Then he returned to Blackwood Hall, where none of that mattered. There, he was evaluated only by his own standards. The contrast exhausted him. By the late 1970s, travel became physically taxing. The mansion saw longer periods of rest between trips. Sanders spent more time at home, walking the grounds, sitting quietly in rooms that held decades of memory. The pace slowed, but the mental pressure did not disappear. If anything, it intensified as time narrowed his options. Inside Blackwood Hall, he confronted questions he had spent his life avoiding. Had he sold too early? Had he trusted the wrong people? Had he underestimated how quickly quality could be sacrificed once scale took priority? These were not questions with answers. They were reflections, looping endlessly, contained within the same walls. Illness accelerated this inward turn. As Sanders's health declined, the mansion shifted again. Activity diminished. Visitors became more personal than professional. Conversations turned reflective. Claudia remained constant, now more caretaker than partner. The house adjusted to accommodate limitations. Rooms once used for meetings became spaces for rest. When Sanders was hospitalized for the final time, Blackwood Hall entered a state of suspension. Claudia returned alone. The phone rang less often. Letters slowed. The mansion became quiet in a way it never had before. After his death, the silence deepened. For Claudia, remaining at Blackwood Hall was both comforting and unbearable. Every room carried memory, every object told a story. The house reminded her not only of success, but of struggle, conflict, loyalty, and endurance. It had been the setting for their shared life, inseparable from it. She chose not to let the mansion become frozen in grief. Instead, she maintained it with intention. The restaurant continued operating. Guests continued arriving. The house remained occupied, functional, alive. Claudia understood that abandonment would erase meaning faster than time ever could. Blackwood Hall needed use to remain relevant. Eventually, stewardship passed to others. The Settles inherited not just property, but responsibility. They recognized that the mansion was not valuable because of its architecture alone. It mattered because of what had occurred inside it. Decisions were made to preserve, not modernize. Objects were left where they had been. Spaces were respected for their history, not repurposed for efficiency. As years passed, visitors began to treat the mansion differently. What had once been a working headquarters became a site of pilgrimage. People wanted proximity to authenticity. They wanted to stand where Sanders had stood, to see what he had seen, to understand how something so global had emerged from something so personal. Blackwood Hall adapted again. It became a container for collective memory, not sanitized, not mythologized, preserved with its contradictions intact. Visitors encountered not a polished museum narrative, but a lived-in environment shaped by persistence, conflict, and discipline. The mansion did not offer easy inspiration. It did not promise shortcuts. What it revealed was harder and more unsettling. That success required endurance long after recognition arrived. That legacy created obligation rather than relief. And that control was always temporary. What happened inside the KFC founder's mansion was not a neat rise and fall story. It was a prolonged negotiation between principle and compromise, played out in rooms that witnessed both triumph and frustration. By the time Blackwood Hall entered the modern era, its meaning had shifted completely. It was no longer about growth or defense. It was about evidence, proof that the story was real. Proof that behind the logo had been a man who worked relentlessly, argued fiercely, loved deeply, and refused to disappear quietly. The mansion remains because it served that purpose well. It held together a life that might otherwise have fractured under its own contradictions. And in doing so, it preserved something no corporate structure ever could: the human cost of building an empire. Time did not erode Blackwood Hall so much as it concentrated it. As decades passed, the mansion accumulated, meaning the way old wood absorbs smoke. Every room became layered with memory, not only of Harlan Sanders, but of the people who passed briefly through his orbit and carried fragments of his influence with them. What had once been a place of instruction and confrontation gradually transformed into a silent witness, its significance growing even as its original purpose faded. Under the stewardship of Thomas and Cherry Settle, the house entered its longest and most stable phase. Unlike Sanders, whose presence filled rooms with force, the Settles governed through restraint. They understood that their role was not to reinterpret the space but to protect it. Change was treated cautiously. Objects were left where they had been found. Furniture was repaired rather than replaced. The goal was continuity, not improvement. This decision preserved something rare. Most homes associated with famous figures are either modernized into comfort or stripped into museums. Blackwood Hall remained neither. It stayed functional without becoming contemporary, historical without becoming staged. That balance allowed the house to retain its atmosphere of work rather than display. Visitors sensed this immediately. Walking through the rooms did not feel like walking through a finished story. It felt like entering a pause. The house seemed mid-thought, as if Sanders might return at any moment to continue an argument or refine a method. That sense of unfinished business was not accidental. It reflected the way Sanders himself lived, always dissatisfied with stasis, always pushing against closure. The Settles also recognized the importance of access. While Blackwood Hall was not open broadly as a museum, it was not hidden either. When appropriate, visitors were allowed inside. Franchise owners, historians, journalists, and longtime customers of the restaurant were given glimpses into the house. These were not guided performances. They were informal encounters, shaped by curiosity rather than spectacle. People asked the same questions repeatedly. Where did he sit? Where did he cook? Where did he sleep? These questions revealed something fundamental. Visitors were not interested in architecture. They were interested in proximity. They wanted to reduce the distance between myth and reality. The mansion offered that reduction without explanation. The kitchen, in particular, carried unusual weight. It was not impressive by modern standards. It was not designed for volume. Yet standing in that space clarified something that branding never could. Sanders's empire did not originate from innovation alone. It originated from repetition, from insistence, from refusing to accept deviation. That philosophy was embedded in the physical limits of the kitchen. There was no room to multitask, no space to hide mistakes. Everything was visible. This physical constraint shaped behavior. It explained why Sanders distrusted expansion that relied on abstraction. Inside Blackwood Hall, food was tactile. Decisions were immediate. Consequences were direct. The mansion reinforced a worldview that became increasingly incompatible with corporate scale. As the years passed, artifacts continued to emerge. Items long forgotten were discovered in drawers, closets, and storage spaces. Letters from politicians, early promotional materials, equipment from experimental phases of the business. These discoveries were not curated intentionally. They surfaced organically, revealing how little Sanders had concerned himself with legacy while he was alive. He saved things not because they were historic, but because they were useful at the time. This accidental archive complicated the narrative around him. It revealed inconsistencies, contradictions, moments of doubt, failed ideas, abandoned directions. Blackwood Hall did not preserve a flawless hero. It preserved a working life, with all its messiness intact. The most striking aspect of these discoveries was their ordinariness. There were no grand manifestos, no long-term strategic plans. The empire had not been engineered through theoretical brilliance. It had been assembled through stubborn iteration. That truth unsettled some visitors who expected inspiration to look more elegant. Yet this ordinariness was precisely what made the mansion powerful. It suggested that transformation was not reserved for visionaries operating at a distance from reality. It belonged to those willing to stay close to process, to remain embedded in execution long after others delegated responsibility away. The fire in 1999 tested this philosophy. When the restaurant burned, the loss was not merely structural. It threatened continuity. The original building had served as both operational space and symbolic anchor. Its destruction could have justified abandonment. Many businesses would have used the fire as an endpoint, a reason to close quietly and preserve memory rather than functionality. The Settles chose the opposite. Rebuilding the restaurant was not framed as modernization. It was framed as restoration of purpose. The new structure accommodated more guests, but the menu did not change. Recipes were followed precisely. The connection to Sanders's standards remained intact. This decision reinforced the idea that legacy was not about preserving form. It was about preserving method. Blackwood Hall itself survived untouched, reinforcing its role as guardian rather than participant. The house did not need to be rebuilt. It simply continued, as it always had, holding context while activity shifted around it. As the 21st century advanced, the world outside the mansion changed dramatically. Fast food became algorithmic, supply chains globalized, branding overtook substance, efficiency became a moral value. Sanders's worldview appeared increasingly antiquated, even inconvenient, and yet interest in Blackwood Hall grew rather than diminished. People came not because they believed the past was superior, but because the present felt unstable. The mansion offered a counterexample. It represented a time when responsibility was traceable, when quality could be attributed to individuals rather than systems, when accountability had a face. This longing was not nostalgic, it was corrective. When news broke that the property might be sold, the reaction was immediate and global. Inquiries came from countries where Sanders had never set foot. The mansion had outgrown its geography. It had become a symbolic asset, representing something increasingly scarce, the physical origin of a global phenomenon. Potential buyers were not merely evaluating square footage or revenue streams. They were assessing whether they could carry meaning without eroding it. The asking price reflected this complexity. Ownership was not about acquisition alone, it was about stewardship. Blackwood Hall had always demanded this. Even during Sanders's lifetime, the house resisted misuse. It could not be converted into something purely performative without losing coherence. Its rooms did not lend themselves to spectacle. Its layout discouraged grandeur. Anyone attempting to impose excess would feel immediately out of place. This resistance explains why the mansion survived with its character intact, while so many historic properties became hollow. Blackwood Hall was never designed to impress. It was designed to function. That purpose insulated it from distortion. Today, the mansion exists in a delicate balance between past and present. It is known but not exhausted, revered but not frozen. Its meaning remains open rather than resolved. Visitors who stand outside often pause before entering. They look at the house, then at the restaurant nearby, then back again. The scale mismatch is striking. One represents global saturation. The other represents localized endurance. The tension between them mirrors the tension Sanders lived with during his final decades. Inside the mansion, that tension is not resolved. It is preserved. This preservation offers a lesson rarely acknowledged in business mythology. Success does not simplify life, it complicates it. Legacy does not provide peace, it creates obligation. Recognition does not conclude struggle, it reframes it. Blackwood Hall captures this truth without commentary. What happened inside the KFC founder's mansion cannot be reduced to anecdotes or slogans. It was a sustained confrontation with consequence, a negotiation between ideals and outcomes, a life lived in proximity to its own impact. The house remains because it earned that endurance. Not through fame, but through use. Not through beauty, but through relevance. It stands as evidence that places matter not because of who is remembered there, but because of what was demanded there. And Blackwood Hall demanded everything. By the time Blackwood Hall entered the public imagination as a historic property rather than a private home, its role had already shifted one final time. It was no longer shaping decisions. It was no longer absorbing conflict in real time. Instead, it had become something rarer and more fragile, a physical explanation. In a world that prefers simplified success stories, the mansion stood as evidence that the truth had been slower, messier, and far more demanding than the brand ever admitted. What happened inside the KFC founder's mansion cannot be understood without acknowledging how isolated Sanders became near the end of his life. Fame surrounded him, but understanding did not. The executives who controlled the company listened politely, then moved on. Franchise owners respected him, but increasingly operated within systems he no longer designed. The public adored the image, but knew little of the man behind it. Blackwood Hall was the only place where none of that mattered. Inside the mansion, Sanders did not have to perform optimism. He did not have to soften his opinions. He could be irritable, disappointed, reflective, and contradictory without consequence. That freedom was essential. Without it, the final decades of his life would have been unbearable. The house functioned as a pressure valve, allowing him to release what the public version of himself could not. Claudia remained central to this equilibrium. Her role inside Blackwood Hall went far beyond administration or hospitality. She controlled access not just physically, but emotionally. She decided who reached Sanders on difficult days and who did not. She filtered information, she redirected conversations when his health or mood required it. In many ways, she served as the boundary between the world Sanders had created and the man who was now struggling to live inside it. This dynamic shaped the atmosphere of the mansion profoundly. Visitors often remarked that Claudia seemed to be everywhere at once, quietly maintaining order without drawing attention to herself. Sanders trusted her judgment completely. When she said no, the answer was final. When she allowed someone inside, it meant Sanders was prepared to engage. That trust extended to business decisions long after the sale of KFC. Although Sanders no longer controlled the corporation, he still controlled his environment. Inside Blackwood Hall, opinions were not softened for diplomacy. Corporate representatives who visited quickly learned that this was not a ceremonial space. Sanders spoke to them as he always had, directly, critically, and without concern for hierarchy. These encounters were often uncomfortable. Executives arrived expecting deference and left unsettled by resistance. Sanders did not argue about growth. He argued about dilution. He did not question profits. He questioned pride. Inside the mansion, surrounded by the evidence of his life's work, he felt entitled to that confrontation. The walls absorbed those exchanges just as they had absorbed training sessions years earlier. The difference was tone. What had once been instructional had become defensive. Sanders was no longer teaching the future. He was protecting the past. As his health declined, this defensiveness softened into something quieter but no less intense. Sanders began to reflect openly on timing. He spoke about how close he had come to quitting permanently, how often failure had seemed final, how little of his success had felt inevitable while he was living it. These conversations occurred not on stages or in interviews, but inside the familiar rooms of Blackwood Hall, often late in the evening, often only with Claudia present. The mansion, at this stage, became a container for reconciliation. Sanders did not regret selling KFC in the conventional sense. He understood why he had done it. What troubled him was not the decision itself, but what followed. The realization that systems do not preserve values automatically. That scale introduces incentives incompatible with craft. That once control is surrendered, influence becomes symbolic rather than operational. Blackwood Hall allowed him to sit with that realization without having to resolve it. The house did not demand answers. It simply held the questions. After his death, that unresolved tension became part of the mansion's identity. Visitors often expected clarity. They wanted lessons neatly packaged. Instead, they encountered ambiguity. The house did not tell them whether Sanders had been right or wrong to sell. It did not confirm whether corporate evolution had improved or degraded the brand. It did not celebrate victory or mourn loss explicitly. It simply existed. This neutrality proved powerful. In an age saturated with narrative framing, Blackwood Hall refused to editorialize. It allowed people to draw their own conclusions based on proximity rather than instruction. Standing in the kitchen where standards had been enforced, visitors felt the weight of discipline. Standing in the living areas, they felt the cost of endurance. Standing on the grounds, they felt the isolation that accompanies prominence. The Settles understood that this openness was essential. They resisted efforts to formalize interpretation. There were no guided scripts imposing meaning. The mansion remained an experience rather than an explanation. That restraint preserved its credibility. Over time, Blackwood Hall began to attract a different kind of visitor. Entrepreneurs came not for inspiration, but for warning. They recognized in Sanders a version of their possible future, celebrated, successful, and deeply frustrated. The mansion offered them a glimpse of what happens when identity becomes inseparable from output. These visitors often lingered. They walked slowly. They asked fewer questions. The house did not energize them. It sobered them. That reaction was not accidental. Blackwood Hall had always been a place where optimism was tempered by reality. The sale listing in the 2020 seconds exposed just how much symbolic weight the mansion carried. Interest was not driven by nostalgia alone. It was driven by a desire to anchor something intangible. Buyers were not just evaluating revenue from the restaurant or appreciation of the property. They were considering whether they could inherit a story without distorting it. That challenge mirrored the one Sanders had faced decades earlier when franchising his recipe. How do you expand something without hollowing it out? How do you transfer ownership without losing meaning? How do you allow growth without surrendering identity? Blackwood Hall posed these questions to every potential steward. The house itself offered no guidance. It did not reward ambition. It did not flatter intention. It simply demanded care. Those who approached it as an asset quickly realized that ownership would not feel triumphant. It would feel heavy. That heaviness is the mansion's final lesson. What happened inside the KFC founder's mansion was not extraordinary because of wealth or fame. It was extraordinary because it exposed the cost of perseverance long after success is achieved. It showed that the end of struggle does not coincide with recognition, that validation does not eliminate doubt, that legacy is not a gift, but a burden passed forward. Blackwood Hall endures because it never pretended otherwise. It stands as a reminder that greatness is rarely comfortable, that impact creates obligation, and that the places where lives unfold matter precisely because they capture contradiction rather than resolve it. The mansion does not celebrate the Colonel as a flawless icon. It preserves him as a human being who refused to stop caring, even when caring became painful. That is what happened inside the KFC founder's mansion, not a fairy tale, not a triumph frozen in time, but a life lived fully, imperfectly, and relentlessly, within walls strong enough to hold it all. As Blackwood Hall moved deeper into the modern era, its significance began to crystallize in a way no one living inside it could have anticipated. The mansion was no longer defined by what happened there day to day, but by what had happened there, and more importantly, by what could never happen there again. It had outlived its original purpose, its original owner, and even the business structures that once depended on it. What remained was something far more difficult to manage than a restaurant or a franchise network: meaning. The danger to Blackwood Hall was never neglect, it was interpretation. As public interest grew, so did the temptation to simplify the story, to turn the mansion into a monument to triumph, to frame it as the inevitable endpoint of a rags-to-riches narrative. But that version of events was incompatible with the reality preserved inside the walls. Nothing about Harlan Sanders' life was inevitable. Nothing about his success followed a clean arc. The mansion resisted being turned into proof of destiny because destiny had never been part of the equation. Inside Blackwood Hall, struggle had not ended with recognition. It had merely changed shape. This truth unsettled many visitors. They arrived expecting inspiration and left with unease. They wanted reassurance that perseverance would be rewarded cleanly, that belief alone could overcome systems, that authenticity would naturally survive scale. Instead, the house offered a harsher lesson. Perseverance extracts a price. Belief can isolate, authenticity requires constant defense, and even then, it may not survive intact. These realizations were not communicated through plaques or displays. They emerged through silence, through the narrowness of the kitchen, through the modesty of the rooms, through the absence of luxury one might expect from a man whose image circled the globe billions of times. Blackwood Hall did not look like success as people imagined it should, and that dissonance was its power. The house revealed that Sanders never fully trusted success. Even at the height of his fame, he behaved like a man who expected loss to return at any moment. That mindset shaped everything that happened inside the mansion. Decisions were cautious, routines were rigid, excess was avoided, comfort was allowed, but indulgence was not. This was not asceticism. It was defense. Sanders had lived too long on unstable ground to believe permanence was guaranteed. Blackwood Hall represented stability, but not safety. It was a place he could stand, not a place he could relax completely. The house absorbed his vigilance. It reflected his refusal to let success soften him. That vigilance extended to memory itself. Sanders did not curate his legacy while he was alive. He did not organize his artifacts, label his achievements, or frame his story. He left objects where they fell. Certificates hung because someone handed them to him, not because he sought display. Letters were saved because they arrived, not because they were historic. This lack of self-mythologizing is what made Blackwood Hall so resistant to distortion later. The house was not arranged to impress future generations. It was arranged to function in the present moment. That practicality became its authenticity. When preservationists later debated how to treat the property, this became the central challenge. How do you preserve a space that was never meant to be preserved? How do you protect meaning without imposing narrative? Every decision risked violation. Too much restoration would sanitize the struggle. Too little would allow decay to obscure truth. Opening it fully to tourism would flatten nuance into entertainment. Closing it entirely would isolate it from relevance. The house demanded restraint. This restraint mirrored the tension Sanders himself had lived with during his final decades. He had been forced to watch his life's work evolve beyond his control. He understood that letting go entirely would erase his influence, but holding on too tightly would fracture relationships and exhaust him. Blackwood Hall was where he practiced that balance daily, never mastering it, never abandoning it. That unresolved tension became the mansion's defining trait. Even now, standing in its rooms feels incomplete in a deliberate way. There is no grand conclusion embedded in the space, no sense of arrival. Instead, there is continuity. The feeling that something was paused rather than finished. That sensation is deeply uncomfortable for a culture addicted to resolution, and yet, it is honest. Sanders did not reach a moment where everything made sense. He did not reconcile fully with the corporation that bore his name. He did not see his standards permanently restored. He did not watch the world slow down to align with his values. He died still arguing, still dissatisfied, still engaged. Blackwood Hall reflects that reality. The mansion does not celebrate closure. It preserves motion. This is why it continues to matter long after the brand itself has been abstracted into algorithms and global supply chains. The house anchors the story in flesh and consequence. It reminds visitors that behind every scalable system is a human being whose limitations were not scalable at all. The modern fast food industry thrives on consistency without intimacy. Blackwood Hall represents the opposite: intimacy without scalability. That contradiction is not nostalgic. It is instructive. It forces uncomfortable questions. What is lost when efficiency becomes virtue? What happens to craft when distance replaces presence? Who bears responsibility when ownership becomes diffuse? These questions were not theoretical for Sanders. They were lived daily inside the mansion. Every phone call announcing a change he had not approved. Every visit to a restaurant serving food he no longer recognized. Every interview where he was expected to smile while privately disagreeing. Blackwood Hall absorbed that cognitive dissonance. The mansion was where Sanders allowed himself to be angry without apology, where he criticized without moderation, where he could reject the polite language of corporate diplomacy and speak in terms of right and wrong as he understood them. That bluntness has often been framed as temperament. In reality, it was philosophy. Sanders believed standards were moral commitments, not preferences. Compromise, in his view, was not neutral. It was degradation. That belief made him difficult to manage and impossible to fully absorb into a corporate structure. Blackwood Hall existed outside that structure, giving him a place where those beliefs remained valid. This separation preserved his integrity at the cost of his peace. Visitors often sense this trade-off even if they cannot articulate it. The house feels heavy not because it is sad, but because it is unresolved. It carries the weight of a man who achieved what he set out to do and still felt incomplete. That incompleteness is what makes the mansion resonate across generations. Entrepreneurs see themselves in it not because Sanders succeeded late, but because he succeeded imperfectly. He did not arrive at harmony. He arrived at influence. And influence brought its own conflicts. The house warns against believing that success will simplify identity. It shows that recognition multiplies obligation, that scale amplifies scrutiny, that once your work belongs to the world, reclaiming it is impossible. Blackwood Hall stands as the final place where Sanders's work still belonged entirely to him. After his death, the house transitioned into collective memory, but even then, it resisted ownership. Those who cared for it learned quickly that stewardship was not about authority. It was about humility. The mansion did not tolerate projection. It did not reward those seeking to imprint themselves onto its story. Instead, it demanded listening. Listening to silence. Listening to contradiction. Listening to the discomfort of ambiguity. This is why the mansion remains difficult to commodify fully. It cannot be reduced to a brand extension without losing coherence. It cannot be transformed into spectacle without becoming false. Its value lies precisely in its resistance to easy consumption. In this way, Blackwood Hall performs a quiet critique of the very system Sanders helped create. The fast food empire thrives on speed, replication, and simplification. The mansion thrives on slowness, specificity, and complexity. One abstracts experience, the other preserves it. This coexistence is not ironic, it is instructive. Sanders was never naive about scale. He embraced it when it served survival. He rejected it when it demanded surrender of values. Blackwood Hall was where he negotiated that boundary repeatedly, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The house records those negotiations not through documentation, but through atmosphere. Standing there, one understands that the real story of the KFC founder was never about chicken. It was about control, about ownership, about the human cost of building something that outgrows its creator. Blackwood Hall is the physical manifestation of that cost. It stands because it has earned endurance through honesty rather than grandeur. It does not pretend Sanders was always right. It does not absolve him of conflict. It does not offer redemption through nostalgia. It offers presence. The presence of a man who refused to disengage from his work, even when disengagement would have been easier. The presence of a woman who anchored him when his own force threatened to consume him. The presence of a life lived in full contact with its consequences. That is what happened inside the KFC founder's mansion. Not a secret recipe, not hidden rooms, not corporate intrigue alone, but something rarer, a sustained, imperfect confrontation with legacy held within walls strong enough to contain it. And that is why Blackwood Hall still matters. Because it proves that behind every icon is a place where the icon was human, and that those places, when preserved honestly, tell far more truth than the logos ever will. By the time Blackwood Hall crossed fully into the category of cultural artifact, the story it carried had begun to outgrow even the people tasked with protecting it. The mansion no longer belonged solely to history, nor did it belong to commerce. It existed in a narrow space between reverence and relevance, where every decision about its future risked distorting the truth it held. This tension mirrored the final contradiction of Harlan Sanders' life. He had built something meant to last, yet he had never believed permanence was guaranteed. That belief shaped how Blackwood Hall functioned long after his death. The house did not demand preservation through reverence alone. It demanded relevance through continued use, careful interpretation, and restraint. What made Blackwood Hall unusual among legacy properties was that it refused to flatten Sanders into a parable. There was no single moral lesson embedded in its walls. Visitors searching for a clean takeaway often left unsettled. The mansion did not say, "Never give up," nor did it say, "Success comes late." Those phrases were too simple, too comforting. Instead, the house asked harder questions without offering answers. Was persistence noble if it caused damage along the way? Was compromise inevitable or avoidable? Did Sanders win, or did he merely survive long enough to be remembered? These questions hung in the air because they had never been resolved during his lifetime. Blackwood Hall preserved that unresolved state with integrity. Inside the mansion, the passage of time did not erase conflict. It clarified it. The longer the house stood, the clearer it became that Sanders' life could not be divided neatly into failure and success. Both existed simultaneously, often in the same moment. The mansion bore witness to that overlap. This was particularly evident in the way Sanders related to recognition. He accepted honors but distrusted praise. He welcomed attention but resented simplification. Blackwood Hall reflected this ambivalence. Certificates hung on walls, but they were not framed theatrically. Photographs existed, but they did not dominate the space. Recognition was present, but never allowed to become the house's purpose. Instead, the mansion remained grounded in routine. Meals, conversations, quiet evenings. The kind of domestic continuity that fame could not disrupt entirely. This grounding mattered more than accolades ever did. It was what allowed Sanders to endure the psychological weight of being both admired and ignored. As corporate ownership of KFC changed hands repeatedly, the distance between the brand and its founder widened. Marketing evolved, language softened, processes became abstract. Yet inside Blackwood Hall, Sanders' standards remained concrete. That contrast intensified over time, turning the mansion into a silent counterpoint to the modern brand. People who worked in corporate environments often felt this contrast immediately. They recognized how rare it was to encounter a space where accountability was personal rather than systemic. Inside Blackwood Hall, responsibility could not be delegated endlessly. Decisions traced back to individuals. Outcomes had faces. This personal accountability was both empowering and exhausting. It explained why Sanders thrived in early stages and struggled later. Scale rewarded delegation. Sanders resisted it. Blackwood Hall was the last place where his resistance made sense. After Claudia's death, the mansion entered another quiet transformation. Without the person who had maintained its internal balance, the house risked becoming either static or sentimental. The Settles understood this risk intuitively. They did not attempt to replace Claudia's role. They honored it by preserving function rather than nostalgia. They allowed the house to age honestly. Wear was repaired, not erased. Changes were minimal. The goal was not to freeze the mansion at a specific moment, but to let it continue existing without betraying its past. This approach prevented Blackwood Hall from becoming a shrine. Shrines simplify. They elevate and isolate. Blackwood Hall remained accessible, imperfect, and grounded. That groundedness protected it from becoming a caricature of itself. As decades passed, the mansion began to attract scholars, not just fans. Historians interested in labor, franchising, branding, and American entrepreneurship found Blackwood Hall valuable precisely because it resisted myth. It offered material evidence of how systems emerge from individuals and how those systems eventually surpass them. The house demonstrated that American success stories are rarely linear. They loop, they stall, they fracture, they recover unevenly. Sanders's life embodied that complexity, and Blackwood Hall preserved it spatially. Walking through the mansion felt like walking through a timeline without labels. There were no arrows guiding interpretation. Visitors moved freely, constructing meaning based on observation rather than instruction. This openness required trust that the story could stand on its own without being curated into inspiration. That trust was well placed. Blackwood Hall did not inspire in the conventional sense. It did not energize or motivate. It sobered. It contextualized. It reminded visitors that building something enduring requires more than vision. It requires tolerance for discomfort, conflict, and unresolved tension. This sobering effect became more pronounced as modern culture leaned increasingly toward optimization. In an era obsessed with scalability, efficiency, and growth, Blackwood Hall stood as an example of something that resisted optimization entirely. You could not streamline the mansion's meaning. You could not scale its atmosphere. You could not extract its value without diminishing it. This resistance made it inconvenient and therefore valuable. It also made stewardship difficult. Anyone assuming responsibility for Blackwood Hall had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Success here would not look like expansion. It would look like preservation without stagnation, like relevance without distortion, like care without control. These were not business skills easily quantified. In this way, the mansion continued to challenge those who encountered it, just as Sanders had challenged franchise owners decades earlier. The medium had changed, but the demand remained the same: respect the process or leave. The house also continued to complicate Sanders's legacy. Popular culture prefers founders to be either heroes or cautionary tales. Blackwood Hall refused both categories. It showed Sanders as neither purely admirable nor purely flawed. He was persistent, demanding, generous, volatile, principled, stubborn, and occasionally blind to his own contradictions. The mansion held all of this without judgment. That neutrality was perhaps its greatest achievement. It allowed Sanders to remain human rather than symbolic. It preserved him not as an icon, but as a man shaped by circumstances, choices, and limitations. This preservation mattered because the world increasingly encounters founders only through narratives designed for consumption. Those narratives erase friction. They smooth edges. They turn complexity into slogans. Blackwood Hall stood in opposition to that trend. It reminded visitors that legacies are not stories we tell after the fact. They are environments shaped over time, influenced by habit, reaction, and repetition. The mansion was not designed to communicate legacy. It accumulated it unintentionally. That unintentional quality is what made it trustworthy. As the future of the property continued to evolve, one fact remained clear. Blackwood Hall could not be separated from its story without losing its reason for existence. Selling the house without its context would hollow it out. Preserving it without use would fossilize it. The only path forward was stewardship rooted in humility. This humility mirrored the paradox at the center of Sanders's life. Despite global recognition, he never believed he was above the work. He cooked, he corrected, he argued, he showed up. Blackwood Hall embodied that ethic long after he was gone. It did not demand admiration. It demanded attention to detail, to contradiction, to the uncomfortable truths that success often obscures. That is why the mansion continues to matter, not as a monument to fried chicken, but as a case study in endurance. It shows what happens when a person refuses to disengage from their values, even when the world moves faster than they can follow. Blackwood Hall does not promise that such refusal leads to peace. It promises only authenticity. And in a culture saturated with performance, authenticity remains rare enough to protect. That is what happened inside the KFC founder's mansion. Not a secret kept, but a life sustained. Not a formula perfected, but a struggle preserved. And that preservation, quiet and unyielding, is the mansion's final contribution to history. As the public narrative around Harlan Sanders continued to harden into mythology, Blackwood Hall quietly did the opposite. It softened the story, not by romanticizing it, but by exposing its edges. The mansion did not correct misconceptions through explanation, it corrected them through presence. Anyone who spent time there could sense immediately that this was not the home of a man who believed he had won. Sanders never behaved like someone who had reached an endpoint. Even in his later years, even after global recognition, he lived as if something still needed to be defended. Blackwood Hall carried that defensive posture in its very layout. Rooms were practical. Furniture was sturdy rather than ornamental. Nothing suggested indulgence. Comfort existed, but it was earned, not displayed. This mattered because it contradicted the cultural image attached to his name. The colonel on the bucket smiled easily. The man inside the mansion did not. He was alert, opinionated, suspicious of ease. He had spent too many decades watching stability collapse to trust it completely. The house absorbed that psychology. What happened inside Blackwood Hall during Sanders's final years was not withdrawal, it was consolidation. He reduced his world deliberately. Fewer voices, fewer opinions, fewer distractions. The mansion became a controlled environment where he could still exercise authority, even as his influence elsewhere diminished. That authority expressed itself in small ways. The timing of meals, the order of conversations, the insistence on punctuality. These details were not eccentricities of old age. They were expressions of control in a life where control had increasingly slipped away. Claudia understood this instinct without needing it explained. She did not challenge his need for structure, she reinforced it. In doing so, she preserved his dignity. Without Blackwood Hall, and the routines it supported, Sanders's final years would likely have been far more chaotic. The house gave him a frame in which to continue being himself. After his death, that frame remained. This continuity is what gave the mansion its unusual emotional gravity. Many historic homes feel emptied once their central figure is gone. Blackwood Hall did not. It felt paused, as if the person who had just stepped out expected to return shortly. That sensation unsettled visitors. They described the house as quiet but tense, orderly but charged. This was not imagination, it was residue. Decades of discipline leave marks, not just on people, but on spaces. The Settles were keenly aware of this atmosphere and worked carefully to avoid disrupting it. They did not introduce unnecessary changes. They resisted modernization that would have made the house feel lighter or more welcoming. Blackwood Hall was not meant to soothe, it was meant to hold. As years passed, the mansion increasingly attracted people grappling with their own transitions. Retired executives, former founders, individuals who had built something meaningful and then watched it evolve beyond recognition. They did not come seeking answers. They came seeking recognition of a feeling they could not articulate elsewhere. Blackwood Hall provided that recognition without commentary. It validated the experience of outgrowing one's own creation, of becoming peripheral to what once defined you, of realizing that success does not conclude effort, but often prolongs it indefinitely. This validation was subtle but powerful. It transformed the mansion from a historic site into a mirror. Visitors did not just observe Sanders's life, they measured their own against it. That mirror was not flattering. Blackwood Hall did not celebrate balance. It showed imbalance lived with rather than resolved. Sanders did not reconcile fully with the corporate future of KFC. He did not disengage peacefully. He remained critical, engaged, and dissatisfied until the end. The house preserved that dissatisfaction honestly. This honesty made the mansion difficult to repurpose. Attempts to frame it as inspirational tourism fell flat. Attempts to commercialize its story felt wrong. Blackwood Hall resisted being turned into a product, just as Sanders had resisted turning his values into abstractions. In this way, the mansion became an unintended critique of modern branding. Brands rely on clarity, on distilled identity, on repetition without contradiction. Blackwood Hall embodied contradiction openly. It held success and bitterness, pride and frustration, generosity, and rigidity in the same space. That complexity could not be simplified without betrayal. As interest in founder stories grew in popular culture, Blackwood Hall stood apart. It offered no formula, no replicable path, no guarantees. It suggested that outcomes depend not only on effort, but on timing, temperament, compromise, and endurance beyond reason. This suggestion was uncomfortable. It undermined narratives that promise control in an uncontrollable world. Yet discomfort is often where truth survives. The mansion's continued existence forced a re-evaluation of what legacy actually means. Legacy is often imagined as reputation. In reality, it is consequence. It is the impact that continues regardless of intent. Sanders did not intend for his image to become universal. He did not intend for his standards to be diluted. He did not intend for his home to become symbolic. And yet, all of these things happened. Blackwood Hall captured that gap between intention and outcome with unusual clarity. It stood as evidence that once something leaves your hands, it will be reshaped by forces you cannot manage. The only control left is how you respond while you still can. Sanders responded by refusing to disengage. The mansion was the stage for that refusal. Even after the restaurant fire, even after corporate transformations, even after his death, that refusal lingered. It was embedded in how the house was treated, in what was preserved, in what was left untouched. Visitors who expected nostalgia often left with something heavier, a recognition that the cost of building something meaningful does not end when success arrives. That vigilance can become exhausting. That letting go may be necessary, but rarely feels complete. Blackwood Hall did not judge Sanders for this. It contextualized him. The house did not ask whether he should have adapted more. It showed what happened because he did not. It did not ask whether the corporation should have listened more. It showed what happened because it did not. In doing so, the mansion avoided moralizing. It became a record rather than a verdict. This record mattered more as time passed. As the original generation with direct memory of Sanders faded, Blackwood Hall remained as a stabilizing reference point. It anchored the story against exaggeration and erasure alike. Without it, Sanders's legacy would have been flattened into a caricature, either the triumphant founder or the cranky old man resisting progress. The mansion preserved the space between those extremes. That space is where reality lives. What happened inside the KFC founder's mansion was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no secret meetings that changed the world overnight. No hidden rooms filled with forbidden knowledge. No single moment that explained everything. Instead, there were days, thousands of them, lived deliberately, often stubbornly, sometimes joyfully, frequently under tension, always with a sense that the work was not finished. Blackwood Hall held those days without interruption. That is why the house remains difficult to summarize. It does not offer a climax. It offers continuity. It does not conclude the story. It sustains it. And in a culture that prefers endings, that may be its most radical act. The mansion does not tell visitors what to believe about Harlan Sanders. It shows them what it looked like to live as him, at least in part, to carry success without relief, to age without disengagement, to be celebrated without peace. That showing is quiet, but it is exacting. It demands that viewers confront the possibility that success is not a solution, but a condition, one that requires constant negotiation, just like failure. Blackwood Hall stands as proof of that negotiation, not as a monument, not as a museum, but as a place where a life continued long after the world decided it was complete. And that continuation, unresolved and unpolished, is the truest answer to what really happened inside the KFC founder's mansion. As the years stretch further from the moment Harlan Sanders last walked the halls of Blackwood Hall, the mansion's meaning has not faded. It has sharpened. Distance has not softened the story. It has stripped away distraction. What remains is not nostalgia, but clarity. Blackwood Hall endures because it represents something modern. Success stories often avoid acknowledging that achievement does not resolve identity. It complicates it. Sanders spent the final decades of his life navigating a paradox few founders are prepared for. He had become indispensable to a brand he no longer controlled, visible everywhere yet decisive nowhere. The mansion was the only place where that paradox could exist without performance. Inside those walls, Sanders did not have to pretend that success felt satisfying. He did not have to translate frustration into optimism. He did not have to explain himself. Blackwood Hall allowed him to exist without narrative pressure. something the outside world no longer permitted. This freedom mattered more than comfort. Comfort suggests rest. Sanders did not rest easily. Even in his later years, even as illness advanced, he remained alert to compromise. He listened for changes. He noticed details. He reacted strongly when standards slipped. The mansion became a container for that vigilance, absorbing energy that might otherwise have consumed him. That vigilance did not vanish with his death. It became part of the atmosphere. People who enter Blackwood Hall often remark on how the space feels disciplined rather than warm. That observation is accurate. The house was not designed to soothe, it was designed to function. It reflects a life shaped by necessity, not indulgence. Sanders never fully escaped the mindset formed during decades of instability. Success did not erase scarcity from his thinking. It only postponed its return. Blackwood Hall preserved that psychology intact. This is why the mansion does not fit comfortably into traditional heritage categories. It is not grand enough to impress, not quaint enough to charm, not dramatic enough to sensationalize. Its power lies in its refusal to perform. It simply exists as it always did, indifferent to expectation. That indifference challenges visitors. Many arrive searching for confirmation that perseverance pays off cleanly. They leave, realizing that perseverance often pays off unevenly, that rewards arrive tangled with new responsibilities. That recognition can feel hollow when control is lost. The mansion does not argue this point. It demonstrates it. Over time, Blackwood Hall has become a reference point in conversations about entrepreneurship that go beyond motivation. It appears in discussions about founder burnout, about the psychological toll of scaling, about the cost of becoming a symbol rather than a participant. These conversations rarely mention chicken. They focus instead on ownership, identity, and endurance. In this sense, the mansion has outgrown its association with KFC specifically. It now represents a broader phenomenon. What happens when a person's life work becomes larger than their capacity to guide it? Sanders experienced this not as abstraction, but as daily frustration. He felt it when changes were announced rather than discussed, when recipes were altered without consultation, when his image was used to sell versions of his product he did not recognize. Blackwood Hall was where those frustrations were processed honestly. The house did not soften his opinions. It amplified them. This amplification is evident in the stories passed down by those who encountered Sanders there. He was blunt. He was critical. He was generous, but conditional. Praise was earned. Respect was demanded. He did not adjust his standards to accommodate convenience. He expected the world to meet him where he stood. That expectation made him difficult. It also made him consistent. Blackwood Hall preserved that consistency spatially. Nothing in the house suggests compromise for appearance's sake. There are no grand gestures meant to impress guests, no renovations designed to signal wealth. The house communicates stability, not success. That distinction matters. Stability is hard-earned. It requires vigilance. Success, by contrast, can arrive suddenly and disappear just as quickly. Sanders understood this intimately. Blackwood Hall was his answer to instability, not his reward for success. After his passing, the house continued to serve this function symbolically. It stabilized the narrative against extremes. It prevented Sanders from being reduced to either hero or obstacle. It held the complexity intact. As new generations encounter his story, Blackwood Hall becomes increasingly important. Without it, the story risks becoming abstract. Brands survive abstraction easily. People do not. The mansion anchors Sanders's life in physical reality. It reminds visitors that he aged, that he argued, that he rested, that he doubted, that he persisted not because he was inspired, but because stopping felt worse. That reminder is not comfortable. It is corrective. In an era saturated with curated success, Blackwood Hall stands as an uncurated life. It does not offer clarity. It offers context. It does not simplify. It complicates. And that complication is precisely what makes it valuable. What happened inside the KFC founder's mansion was not extraordinary because of secrecy or spectacle. It was extraordinary because it revealed what happens after success, when the cameras leave and the work remains. It revealed a man unwilling to disengage from his values, even when disengagement would have been easier. It revealed a partnership that functioned under pressure without recognition. It revealed a life lived in constant negotiation with consequence. Blackwood Hall did not resolve those negotiations. It preserved them. That preservation allows the mansion to continue speaking, even in silence. It speaks to anyone who has built something meaningful and then struggled to recognize it later. To anyone who has succeeded publicly while wrestling privately. To anyone who suspects that achievement does not end the story, but complicates it. The house does not offer reassurance. It offers truth. And truth, unlike inspiration, does not fade with repetition. As the sun sets over Shelbyville and the lights of the restaurant glow across the parking lot, Blackwood Hall remains still. It does not demand attention. It does not advertise its significance. It simply waits, holding the weight of a life that refused to conclude neatly. That is what continues to happen inside the KFC founder's mansion. Not revelation, not closure, but endurance.